Welcome to CFTC Talks. I'm your host, Andy Bush. You know, there are many positions in the White House, but one of the key jobs is the role of the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, or the CEA. Now, the council is an agency within the executive office of the U.S. president, and its main job is to offer the president objective economic advice on the formulation of both domestic and international economic policy. And today, we are just so pleased to have on the chairman of the CEA, Kevin Hassett. Mr. Chairman, welcome to CFTC Talks.
Oh, it's great to be here, but you better call me Kevin.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman is it's only when we need to extract something from the administrative office or something. Is to say, oh, well, Mr. Chairman needs this or something. I'm Kevin.
Okay. Well, that's no problem. I think that's a good way to start, because one of the ways I want to start this interview is actually talking about people's early career and lessons learned. That's kind of what we do. And to that end, we could talk about your time as a professor of economics at Columbia, or your time at the Federal Reserve in the Division of Research and Statistics. However, I want to talk to you about growing up in Greenfield, Massachusetts, and playing for the Turnbulls of the Greenfield minor league baseball team. What did you take away? Go ahead.
Yeah, I think that at first did somebody put that on my Facebook page, I think, but or maybe Wikipedia, but I didn't play for Turnbulls. I played for Inkwell. At some point, someone needs to correct.
Okay,
Inkwell. It was Inkwell News was a newsstand in my hometown in Western Massachusetts, and they sponsored the Little League team I played on. And I think that Greenfield is just a fantastic place. I was just there for Thanksgiving. I played Little League there. One of my coaches was my dad, who I was visiting for Thanksgiving, who still lives up there. And it's one of these towns that could be like in the Shire in Lord of the Rings. It's just lots of beautiful farms and amazing produce and beautiful churches and covered bridges and nice fall foliage and so on. And that's why people listening should think about going to visit, because it's such a great place. But when I was growing up there, it was going through a difficult transition because it was a traditional New England mill town. And the Greenfield Tap and Die was the largest employer in town, and you could Google what it does, but it's like machine stuff. And the Tap and Die was running into hard times and shutting down to a real bare bones operation.
Right.
And that really hit the economy of Greenfield hard. And so when I was growing up and going to high school in the 70s, most people weren't thinking about college. I don't know what percentage of the high school class went to college, but maybe it was 20%, something like that. And most people were looking forward to living in Greenfield and wondering how they were going to do that because the jobs were so scarce.
Yeah, that was a difficult time, obviously, and you got to witness firsthand a lot of the changing and evolving nature of the economy, and probably how it was impacted by international issues, even way back then.
Yeah, that's right, and then watch the town grow. My mom, who passed away a while ago, was a Republican politician, believe it or not, and she was always involved in local issues like whether Greenfield should have a Walmart. She argued that they should, because otherwise people would just go to the next town's Walmart, and which proved to be true. So whatever effect the Walmart was going to have on the shops in the town, she argued, was going to happen anyway, because whatever town took the Walmart wasn't going to be that far away. And anyway, so it's interesting to watch it mature as a town. But the thing that really it did for me is make me wonder about having a career in economics, because I started to puzzle over, why did the economy just, take such a long time to adjust, and could economic policy have been better? And maybe it's also where my conservatism came from too, is that don't forget that back then we used to, it's probably still a little bit true, but there have been, Mitt Romney was governor and so on, but back then everybody called it Taxachusetts. Right? So,
sure.
And so I'm growing up in this town where there are no jobs, and living in Taxachusetts, and it made me start to wonder about how government policies affect prosperity.
Well, let's shift gears here and go from playing on a baseball diamond to maybe making an economic diamond through tax reform. For our audience, let's start off with why a government would want to do tax reform. And correct me if I'm wrong here, but the goal is to create economic growth and simplify the tax code to reduce, obviously, the cost of complying with it. Do I have that right?
Yeah, I think that President Trump really has three main non-negotiables in this tax bill. One is that we get a competitive corporate tax system again with a corporate rate of 20%. The second is that we have a big middle-class tax cut, and the third is that the tax code become a lot simpler. And I think that all three are very important for the economy. The compliance costs for the tax code are just enormous. Most Americans, use a professional tax preparer, which is kind of crazy, right? Even low-income people.
Right.
The middle class certainly hasn't seen its welfare improve at the rate that the overall economy has in the last 8 years or so. And, I think that the first thing, the corporate tax rate to 20 is probably a big reason why. And it's just that right now we have the highest corporate tax in the developed world and a system that rewards companies for locating production offshore. And so if you're a manufacturer, maybe used to have a factory in Greenfield, if you put the factory in Greenfield, then if you count the Massachusetts corporate profit tax, and you're going to be paying more than 40% of your profits to the government in taxes. If you locate the same plant in Ireland, then you pay about a quarter of that in taxes, right? And so think about how much more productive the U.S. workers have to be to convince a business to locate the manufacturing in Greenfield as opposed to Ireland. That's I think one reason why is that the U.S. economy has been so slow in recent years. And so the tax plan that is hopefully going to make its way through the Senate this week is a big part of addressing that problem. And I think that the middle class tax cut is going to make sure that there's sort of immediate punch to the bill as well. It'll take a while for factories to move back, which they will once the rate gets low. But the middle class tax cut should be visible in your withholding as soon as your first paycheck comes in January if this becomes law.
Yeah, you brought up Ireland, and I guess the question is, for some perspective and context for our audience. I mean, this isn't just like tax reform is not just a U.S. thing. Other countries have done it, right?
Yeah, that's right. And so we, in fact, have data going back for decades for, a little bit less than 100 countries. And so that's a heck of a lot of data for economists to pour through. And when they do, they find that countries that have reduced their corporate rates have tended to see big improvements in wages and, a big lift in economic growth. And they've not tended to have problems with higher deficits. And it all kind of makes sense that if you want to have a higher wage, then you can go to school and get more skills, or you can hope that your employer, or if you're self-employed, you could do it yourself, would give you a better machine to work with. Back when I was mowing lawns for a living in Greenfield, I used to push around. I started by pushing around a little mower that was just like, a mower with a blade and that's it. And then at one point we got this Honda, I remember it was a Honda self-propelled front-wheel drive self-propelled mower, and it was just much easier to pull on.
Very fancy.
Yeah, but I mean, the point is the darn thing was fast, and it was a lot easier. It didn't get hung up in every little bump in the yard and stuff. Sure. And so that self-propelled mower really improved the productivity of 11-year-old Kevin, and made it I could make more money because I could mow more lawns, and so that's kind of where wages come from. And right now the self-propelled mowers are the equivalent, in manufacturing space are, they're located in Ireland, not here. And that, it's rare to find the company that's expanding its production facilities here. And it's not that our workers aren't great or our, towns aren't, good places for people to, want to operate. It's that the tax penalty for putting the production in the U.S. is so high that it's really discouraging job creation.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that from both the House and the Senate plans that they have in there. But let me ask you this: what are the biggest drivers of growth within these plans when you're looking at corporate or pass-through tax reform?
Oh, yeah. So I think that, in the end, the literature is pretty clear that what influences growth is something called the cost of capital. And the cost of capital depends on depreciation rules and tax rates. And if we had a whiteboard, we could go through the formulas and maybe, some folks listening. I guess if you're nerdy enough to be listening now, you might actually enjoy the equations, I suppose. But yeah, the cost of capital is really the fundamental driver of growth in this tax bill. And a lot of the measures, like the individual components of both the House and the Senate bill, have an influence on the cost of capital. And so take it as a whole, it's the cost of capital. You want to make it so that firms can buy a machine located in the U.S., keep a good chunk of the profit that they get if the machine is successful, and not understate their expenses for buying the machine. And if you put that all together, that's really where the growth comes from this bill.
Yeah, the full expensing component, I think if you look at groups like the Tax Foundation, that in their tax model, that drives a huge part of the growth that comes from these plans on tax reform. And I think and correct me if I'm wrong again here, but when you fix the international component of what we have, this repatriation tax at 35%, and then you marry that to the full expensing, you create an investable pool of capital, and then you give it an incentive to do something. And I think, to me, right, just as an observer, that seems to be a very big driver of potential of growth.
Right, and the way to think about the role of expensing is just this, that in the current law, then, if you were to buy an expensive lawnmower for your lawnmower company, then when the government asks you to calculate your profits so they can apply a profit tax to it, they don't let you deduct the full cost of the machine. They make you write the machine cost off over a number of years. And so, I'm not sure what the asset life for lawnmowers is, but let's say that it's 5 years, then what you would do is you'd get 20% of the expense you get to deduct each of the next 5 years. And so what that means is that suppose that you had income this year of 100 and you spent 100 on a machine, then the business actually didn't deliver any profit to you this year, right? Because you spent 100 on a machine, and say a machine plus gas was 100, and then you got 100 in sales, so your income is zero. Well, the government is only going to let you subtract 20 cents for the cost of the machine, and so it's going to say that you have an income of 80 cents, even though your income really this year was zero. And so now you got to pay tax on 80 cents, even though you don't have any income, and that's a weird place to be, right? And so that helps you understand where the power of expensing comes from.
Right, and for that plant and equipment, we were talking about generating economic growth and making workers more productive. Well, you do that by making investments in new equipment to make those workers more productive. And the end game, of course, is to raise GDP through that increase in productivity.
That's right. And, I think that, as President Trump was elected, then, Democratic economists were saying that we're, doomed to grow, less than 2% or around 2% for, as far as the eye can see. And that the reason is that, the government isn't spending enough money. I think that we've seen that the deregulation part of the president's portfolio is already sort of kicking in, and there's business optimism again, and you're starting to see GDP growth more in the 3% range. And I think that if we now double down and toss a good tax reform on top of that, then we could be comfortable that this idea that we're in a new normal that stinks is going to be a matter of like a historical inaccuracy, because we're going to from here be able to do a lot better than that.
Well, I guess it begs the question then: what does your research show that the president's tax reform plan can generate on economic growth and simplification? I mean, that's the bottom line, right? Everybody wants to know that.
Yeah, sure. And we put out a couple of reports on this that estimated the effect using 4 completely different literatures, and then summarize the evidence that really conservatively that we think that you could see GDP growth over the next decade that lifts GDP 10 years from now to a level that's 3 to 5% higher than what it would have been otherwise. And now 3 to 5% doesn't sound like a whole lot, but let's use 5% because it's a nice round number, or half a round number, right? And so CBO says that there's going to be 28 trillion in GDP in the baseline right now, 10 years from now. And so 5% of that is 1.4 trillion more GDP.
Wow.
And so imagine you get 1.4 million more GDP 10 years from now, because if we pass the tax bill this week or soon, and if we don't, then that's really an amazingly squandered opportunity, because 10 years from now we'll be wondering where our 1.4 trillion is if we do nothing, right? And so another way to think about it is that right now, we could have another, say, trillion in GDP if, when President Obama came into office, instead of spending all his money on cash for clunkers and things like that, they had a serious tax. Yeah.
Right.
And so right now,
I love that
$1 trillion.
program. That was a fun program. I remember that one well, having had a couple of clunkers at that time. But I don't think it just moved forward all the purchases of automobiles, right? And that's what they were trying to do. Well, I guess let me just ask you about this question. You brought up 1.4 trillion or ish, but what do you say to critics who say the plan, obviously, from what we're seeing from the House and the Senate, is going to cost 1.5 trillion? I guess people would say, well, why not just do a big fiscal spending program of that amount like that was done under President Obama?
Yeah, well, I think that the answer to that is really quite simple, which is that if you look at, the capital deepening's contribution to productivity and wage growth, then since World War II, it's averaged, a little less than 1% a year, so that you could see your wage go up by 1% a year. If you're a little less than that, but about, say, 1% a year, if you just sit back and let the self-propelled lawnmowers arrive. And what happened in the second part of President Obama's term is that capital deepening's contribution to productivity and wage growth actually went negative for the first time since the Second World War. And so that there was more sort of destruction of machines and depreciation of machines than there was investment. And wages didn't go up because the machines that people were using were actually worse. It's like they were driving the clunkers,
right.
To the factory. And that's if we get capital deepening back to its historic average, then it's going to be a massive pay increase over a 4 or 5 year period for Americans.
Well, let's switch gears just a little bit, because you brought up regulatory reform and that is moving forward. One of the very first actions, as you're aware, taken by President Trump was issuing an executive order on reducing and controlling regulatory costs. Give our audience some context here, Kevin. Why did the president act on this, and what's the goal here?
Well, I think that what happened was that, the president came into the White House and inherited the White House from an administration that believed that, if you just hand regulatory agencies over to, Harvard-trained professionals, then they'll be able to, basically regulate America's businesses into some kind of nirvana. And the aggressiveness with which they, tossed new regulations at America's businesses was unprecedented. That you see, 1,500 to 2,000 new regulations every year, and of course, if there's say 2,000 new regulations in a year, then it's not just the complying with the new regulations that firms start to think about, but also the fact that if there's 3 more years of President Obama's guys in the White House, then there's going to be 6,000 more regulations over the next 3 years. And so that business optimism, it went into the tank, even though the economy was recovering, and the new regulations imposed an enormous compliance burden on firms. Think about it. If you and I were running a company, then if all of a sudden Washington wrote a new reg that influenced the way we had to operate, then we got to hire all these people to study the regulation and figure out how we're going to comply. And so there's this really big marginal cost. And what President Trump did is he basically said, well, I understand that we have to protect the environment. He wants clean air as much as the next guy, but let's just pause and let's start to take stock of where we are. And let's just, while we're studying it, right at the beginning of his administration, let's more or less stop new regulations, which has happened. And the American Action Forum put out an estimate last summer that said already by July or so, American firms had spent 6 million fewer man hours complying with just new regulations. And so if you're wondering why businesses are optimistic and they're investing in America again, even though the tax bill hasn't quite passed, it's because that part of the burden has been reduced enormously.
Well, what's the growth potential here? I mean, just stopping the regulations from increasing in an exponential way seems to have engendered a lot of the animal spirits for America's CEOs and even consumers to some extent. But I'm sure you guys at the CEA have done some work on this. I'm sure you have. What do you think is the potential to add to GDP and jobs?
Well, there is a literature that looks at the effect of deregulation on economic growth and finds very significant positive effects of deregulation on growth. But the literature is always, a little bit, it's harder to judge than, say, the tax literature, because regulation is a pretty weird thing to measure. As an example, one measure that people sometimes use is the number of words in the Federal Register.
Right.
But if we, rewrite regulations in order to undo some past regulations, then the number of words in the Federal Register goes up, right? And
so maybe that's not the best one to use, right?
Yeah, right, exactly. And so that there are other measures like the OECD and the World Bank have cost of doing business measures and so on. And smoothing through the ups and downs of the literature, I think that the deregulation that President Trump has in train already is, easily can account for, 2 to 5/10 of GDP growth, per year. Exactly what the exact number is something that's still a work in progress. So you have to wait and see what deregulation has accomplished and how well we can measure it. But the link between deregulation and growth is very, very strong in the economic literature.
Well, one last question before I let you go. Let's put tax reform and regulatory reform aside for a minute. Give me your things that you're looking at that you're going to be focused on for 2018, because it's coming up and we're going to get a lot of interest in this. There's so many things that are going to happen next year, whether it's the Winter Olympics or whether there's elections in Brazil and Mexico. There's so many things going on internationally. What are the three things that you are already pointing to in 2018 in your mind?
Well, I think that as we think about the economic outlook for the next year, one thing that economists will keep an eye on is the extent to which the normalization of monetary policy has an impact on the economy. It's something we're watching closely. Of course, we respect the independence of the Fed and wouldn't advise them about what they should do. But if you're thinking about, what the sort of upside and downside scenarios look like, then certainly you'd be trying to factor in, what happens when monetary policy, takes its foot off the gas a little bit. I think that the two big policy items that we'll all be working on in the White House, are publicly known. We're working on them now, but will lift the level of activity if tax reform passes immediately. Our infrastructure, the president, has back to the campaign said that our infrastructure is unacceptable, which it is, and he's got lots of ideas for how to make that better. And also, I think that our team is looking closely at welfare reform as well.
Okay, great. Well, Kevin, thanks for coming on the show today. This has been a real treat to have you on. And I'd love to get you back on next year, and we'll follow up, maybe have more of this conversation.
See how it went. Yeah, that's right. It'd be great to be back. Thanks for having me.
You bet. Yeah. All right, we'll be back next week.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. We'll be back next week with another guest on our quest to learn about the markets we watch. I'm Andy Bush. Thanks for listening. But wait, we're not done yet. It's time for a disclaimer. The CFTC is providing this information as a public service, and it is neither a legal interpretation nor a statement of CFTC policy. Reference to any specific product, service, trademark, manufacturer, or service provider does not constitute an endorsement or recommendation by the CFTC. The CFTC is not liable to any consumer or any third party for any direct, indirect, incidental, consequential, special, or exemplary damages or lost profit related to the use of the information provided or referenced in this podcast. Selection of guests on the podcast does not imply an endorsement of any particular individual or entity. Many individuals and entities provide similar services to those of the guests. The views and opinions expressed by the guests in the podcast are their own and not specifically endorsed by the CFTC. Moreover, the information provided in this podcast should not be construed as investment advice. Consumers should rely on their own inquiries as to accuracy and relevance of the information incorporated or referenced in this podcast and assume the entire risk related to its use. The CFTC is providing its interpretation of market trends solely to inform the public of a framework for projecting possible outcomes under different scenarios. If you have any questions concerning the meaning or application of a particular law or rule administered by the CFTC, please consult an attorney.